Hey guys, it's Dove again. With today's video, I wanted to kind of discuss three different terms that are used a lot in pop culture, and unfortunately are very misused by a lot of people. People tend to throw these terms around very loosely. They don't usually understand the definitions or the history behind them. These terms that I want to discuss are highly controversial and not very well understood by the public, and clinicians even to this day have difficulty agreeing on what these terms really mean. Um, and of course, the terms I'm talking about are terms like psychopath, sociopath, and antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is a lot better defined than terms like psychopathy and sociopathy. To get into it, I would like to first discuss the term psychopathy. Um, Historically, psychopathy is derived from Greek, and it can literally be translated to, say, a pathos. It means to suffer. Suffering. It could also be translated as like an illness or a sickness, as well as psyche, which could mean the soul or the mind. So put those two together, you get kind of a suffering mind or a suffering soul. And historically, prior to any solid foundation of psychology, it was used to describe really mental illness in general. So, late 1800s, early 1900s, somebody with a condition like autism could be described as a psychopath, which is, would sound strange today. Today, psychopathy as a term is highly, highly controversial in the field of psychology. And it really depends on who you ask as to whether it's even real or not. Um, it's debated whether it's a more severe form of something called antisocial personality disorder. It's debated as to whether maybe it's entirely separate, its own entity, and it could maybe have a relation to ASPD, as antisocial personality disorder is called. Psychopathy, as it's understood by certain people in specific fields like forensic psychology, psychopathology, things like that, is generally understood to be a form of antisocial personality disorder that is more severe in its characteristics, um, and it tends to carry certain symptoms like higher levels of callousness, lower levels of empathy, maybe a little bit more aggressiveness. But what really makes a psychopath in these terms is a true lack of remorse and lack of empathy. With a psychopath, there is no exception to these symptoms. Um, Psychopaths also tend to have a little bit more self-control than some people with ASPD. So psychopaths can be more, calculated and more methodical in things like manipulative tactics and, the way that they treat others. So a psychopath is more likely to be the, more charming type, the complimentary type, the brighter on the outside, very friendly, very outgoing, very sociable. Um, Psychopaths generally are very difficult to spot, and there are classes and lessons out there to teach you how to spot psychopaths, but that is still very difficult. Even professionals to this day have a hard time, deciding that somebody's a psychopath. It takes a long time in therapeutic or forensic institutions to figure out that somebody is indeed a psychopath. What I would like to do on this channel is kind of break the mold of this kind of forensic clinical concept of what psychopathy is, because a lot of the research done on psychopaths are from forensic institutions like rehabilitation centers, penitentiary centers, prisons, that sort of thing. So more often than not, what you find with a psychopath that is being studied is a hardcore drug addict or a murderer that shows no remorse, something along those lines. So it's rare to find a psychopath or a sociopath or somebody with ASPD that is willing to provide information regarding the condition without being, put under the thumb of plea deals, stuff like that. And that is what I would like to emphasize with this channel, is that psychopaths are not inherently evil like the media might have you believe. I think that we are more neutral, and that neutrality is a sort of kind of symptom, I guess, of psychopathy. Something that is included on what is called the PCLR, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, which was made by a Dr. Hare. He devised a list of symptoms, essentially criteria. These criteria, the more you meet, the higher your score would be, and somebody, between like the scores of like say 30 and 40 would be described as a psychopath. I personally have scored a 34 on this test, but I'm generally not too, horrible towards others. And that's what I would like to express largely with this channel, is that a lot of people with ASPD and that might be described as a psychopath by some clinicians are not inherently violent. They're not all going to be serial killers or mass murderers, or they're not all just gonna like use you for profit and pleasure and then throw you in the trash. We are, as individuals, complex people, just like any other condition out there. ASPD is a mental illness like anything else out there. To treat somebody with bipolar in this generalized box of, okay, this is what bipolar people do, this is how they act, and I have to treat them this way because I have to expect this reaction from them, that's improper, that's inappropriate, that's rude and stigmatizing. And unfortunately, largely, that's what has happened to psychopaths. Now, on the other hand, there's another term called sociopathy, and this is a much, much more controversial term. It's actually not really used much today anymore at all. In any research I've done, anything I've watched or listened to, there's little to no clinical basis for a term called sociopathy. It's used more in a colloquial sense, more for describing a psychopath or somebody with ASPD, but having more traits of something like, say, borderline. They might be more impulsive. They might be a little bit more aggressive. These are the type of people who will commit a crime on the fly and, show no remorse for it. They're a lot more likely to be blue-collar criminals, low-end drug dealers, maybe gang members, stuff like that. These are the people that generally, you get abused by a psychopath. These are the people generally that inflict that harm. Psychopaths in this scenario tend to be more the white-collar criminals, if they're criminals at all, where they might embezzle money or, evade taxes, stuff like that. Sociopaths also have a very low affective empathy. And to be clear about that, people with ASPD tend to have low levels of empathy, if any at all. We do have something called cognitive empathy, meaning that I can imagine somebody's scenario and come to a logical conclusion and understanding of why they are reacting to a situation a certain way, and, figure out how I should respond to that situation. Sociopaths tend to be a little bit more harsh, they will make it clear and obvious that they don't care about your well-being. They don't care about, what you're upset about. If you're, say, somebody's just bawling their eyes out, they're crying, they're, at the end of the road having a breakdown, a sociopath might be more likely to berate them for that than a psychopath. A psychopath tends to be more likely to be kind and pleasant towards that person. And it is, on some level, deceitful, but it's not necessarily malicious, and I want to make that distinction clear. It could be coming from a good place. It could be a good intention to assist somebody, and I mean, at the end of the day, deep down, we don't really care about this person's well-being, and that sounds harsh, but it's not, a great concern of ours. But what is beneficial really is helping others. there is a social and communal benefit to altruism. So psychopaths do have the capacity to be altruistic, while sociopaths tend to be a little bit more overtly self-centered. I watched one video on YouTube, which is actually a fairly popular video. Some of you may have seen it, but it was discussing the anatomy of the brain of psychopaths and sociopaths. And the person in that video actually described, sociopaths as, say, like a rabid dog, while a psychopath is more of a trained attack dog. And personally, I find that a little dehumanizing, just a tad. That's not the best analogy to use, and it shows to what extent we're seen. But it does work in a sense. I do see his intention behind that analogy, and it does make sense to some extent, and it does relate decently well to the reality of the situation, that psychopaths tend to be a little bit more restrained and self-controlled. Even if we get angry, we have much more control over that anger than a sociopath might. Another major distinction between, say, psychopathy and sociopathy is kind of the nature versus nurture element. And with any condition out there, it is almost always some combination of these two elements, your genetics versus how you were raised. And it's psychopathy and sociopathy are no exception. Psychopathy, however, tends to have more of a genetic component. There's a number of genes that have been found that relate to psychopathy, or your chances of developing psychopathic traits. Sociopathy, however, tends to be more environmental. It tends to be more learned, these traits. It tends to be seen more of as like survival mechanisms. You're put through very difficult situations in your childhood and develop these traits as a mode of continued survival. And to be clear, with psychopathy, on the other hand, there generally is some level of trauma, underlying trauma, whether it's overt or covert, something has happened to this child to bring about psychopathy still. Even if you have genetics, regardless of the disorder, there has to be some event, something in your life that flips that switch for it to actually, be actualized. So on that note, it's not too far different from other personality disorders, and that's where I'll bring in, say, antisocial personality disorder, that third term. Antisocial personality disorder is actually the diagnostic clinical term for things like psychopathy and sociopathy. Psychopathy is not an actual diagnosis. It's more of a descriptor term used very loosely in clinical settings. It's not really a popular term to use by a doctor. It's very poorly understood, very, very misunderstood, and it can't really be used as a diagnosis. It's more of a series of traits that you can have that make you more psychopathic, but it itself is not a diagnosis. The diagnosis that you would receive if you met psychopathic traits would be called antisocial personality disorder. Now, antisocial personality disorder is a cluster B personality disorder. And cluster B personality disorders are kind of these wild, eccentric, dramatic sort of personality disorders. The disorders included in this category, it's a subcategory really, are borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. All of these conditions generally have some basis of trauma, namely borderline personality disorder is largely a response to trauma, and in a similar sense as is antisocial personality disorder. There's evidence that certain socioeconomic, sociocultural elements might, contribute to the development of ASPD. There's also a lot of evidence of genetic factors, of course, that say if you have a first-degree relative with ASPD or traits of ASPD, that you could develop it as well. There's some evidence pointing towards the idea that parents with borderline personality disorder, which might result in, say, inconsistent parental discipline, kind of a chaotic or difficult to manage childhood could, you know, develop into antisocial personality disorder. And oftentimes, most times, psychopathy, ASPD, it can be noticed early, usually with something called conduct disorder. And that is kind of a little bit more baseline psychopathy. It's something that in order to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, you must experience before the age of 15. And I personally did have that experience. And it's very vague, basic disorder of not following the proper cultural conduct that society deems necessary for you to, prosper as a child. It might involve criminality at a young age. It might involve drug use with very little limits at a young age. And it generally is a display of a lack of concern towards others. It could present itself as bullying. It could present itself as harming others or animals, unfortunately. And to this day, in terms of treating psychopathy, there's actually very little in the ways of hope for prognosis. There's very little evidence or research to be found on how to treat ASPD. The closest that we have is kind of trying to prevent it with children with conduct disorder or something else called oppositional defiant disorder, which itself could be a precursor. Um, so in the present state of psychology today, what we see is an attempt to prevent psychopathy in the first place. That might be our best bet in treating it. So I am personally diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. I have been described as a psychopath as opposed to a sociopath. And, depending on who I've asked, which clinician I've gone to, some are more willing to use the term psychopath than others. Some see it as controversial, some see it as kind of demonizing and stigmatizing, some don't like the term at all. Some prefer the term just generally, antisocial. Personally, I don't care what you want to call it. It is what it is. I do like a little bit more nuance and complexity when it comes to these very difficult to define conditions like psychopathy, so having this kind of divisive factor between psychopathy and sociopathy and more of a baseline condition of ASPD, I think is beneficial in the long run, but that's more for, the professionals to decide. So I hope that this kind of baseline information has helped a little bit in terms of understanding what psychopathy is and sociopathy. In future videos, I'll kind of discuss my own personal experience with psychopathy as I've grown up with it, as I've, entered into adulthood and experiencing daily life with it, and how it impacts me, how it impacts the people around me, how I've chosen to kind of cope with it and do well with it, So yeah, stick around, like, subscribe.